So it's come around pretty quickly, but we are already starting a new series again. And you'll be pleased to know that in this series, we're being proper Anglicans. We are actually following what the lectionary tells us to follow at the moment. It makes a change, I know. But there's a reason for it. Actually, there's a really good reason for it. Because actually, at the moment, we have the seasons of church life in mind. Because the 24th of May is Pentecost. It's the celebration in church life of when the Holy Spirit first came on the disciples in Jerusalem. Now, prior to that, there have been all kinds of incidents with the Holy Spirit involved in people's lives, on certain people, in certain places, at certain times. But it was only at Pentecost that it became the Holy Spirit for all, in all places, at all times. And so in the Sundays leading up to Pentecost, we are going to be following the lectionary, which points us towards some of the amazing things that the Holy Spirit does. In the passage we've just heard, you'll have noticed that, first of all, an angel of the Lord spoke to Philip. Then the Spirit spoke to Philip. And then later on, after the Ethiopian is baptized, the Spirit of the Lord whisks Philip away and he appears somewhere else. And it's all with purpose, incredibly with purpose. So do you know who the first reported person who is both a converted believer from another faith and baptized? So the first person converted into the faith and then baptized. Who is that person? And you'll probably have guessed that actually the first person converted from outside of Judaism is actually this Ethiopian. This is the first person in the Bible who comes from outside in. And legend has it that he was the first evangelist to Ethiopia. And of course, their brand of Coptic Christianity endures to today. And it looks back to this incident as its origin. But this Ethiopian is not who we might have expected to be in on the in crowd straight away. No doubt he is wealthy and powerful. His position would have come with that kind of status. But actually, first of all, he's from hundreds of miles away. So he's not one of the in crowd in Jerusalem. Secondly, he is ethnically totally different to those first believers in Jerusalem. Almost definitely he was a black African. And thirdly, in their culture, he's a eunuch. He would have been despised as only half a person, rather than pitied as the victim of genital mutilation. So he's seen as an outsider because he is literally from miles away, because he's ethnically very different, and actually because in their culture he would have been despised. And yet, the Holy Spirit is doing amazing things to bring about his conversion. So first of all, the Ethiopian himself was inspired to go to Jerusalem to worship. Not only was he inspired to go to Jerusalem to worship, but he actually acted on it as well. And Philip acts on it when the angel tells him to go to the desert road. Philip wasn't one of the 12 apostles. Not an apostle, not an evangelist either. He was one of the 7 chosen as deacons, the ones who were supposed to wait on tables, the ones who were supposed to make sure that the food distribution in the church that the church made to the weak and the vulnerable was done fairly. He was a practical guy. He may even have been an admin kind of a guy. And like Stephen, his fellow deacon, when the Holy Spirit asks something of him, he just gets on and he does it. And just a little bit earlier in Acts, it's the second half of the passage that Joyce read to us in verses 4 to 8. After that first persecution of the church, he turns up in Samaria. And this is what we read. Philip went down to a city in Samaria and proclaimed the Christ there. When the crowds heard Philip and saw the miraculous signs that he did, they all paid close attention to what he said. With shrieks, evil spirits came out of many, and many paralytics and cripples were healed. So there was great joy in that city. He has obviously become somebody who is very accustomed to listening to the voice of the Holy Spirit and acting on it. And actually, that can be any of us. There are no restrictions. We heard, for example, in our latest Alpha course about somebody's experience. They had a very strong picture in their mind of a geometric pattern and a message that seemed to go with it. They had no idea who it was for. They had no idea what this geometric pattern meant. They didn't know what to do with it. So they just quietly prayed about it. Anyway, after a long time gap, one Sunday they suddenly saw this pattern in church. It wasn't actually in church here, it was in church somewhere else, but they saw this pattern. And I forget whether it was on somebody's clothing or it was a tattoo or something else like that. But with great fear and great trepidation, they told them the message that they felt went along with this geometric pattern, because suddenly they'd seen it. And actually, as a result of that, both the giver of the message and the receiver of the message were hugely blessed. It was a very pertinent thing that was being said. But it was a scary thing for them to have to do. Would they do it again? Yes, they probably would, but with no less fear and trepidation. Because we all need to be sure that actually, when we are thinking something, that we're actually hearing the Holy Spirit aright and not just hearing our own thoughts. Another, for example, sometimes we don't even really know that these Holy Spirit incidents are happening until they've actually happened. I'm telling you a story from about 15 years ago. Liz and I were in China. We were in Beijing West Railway Station. It was before we ever moved out to China. We were having a 2-week holiday, but we were there with a purpose. We were there, as far as we were concerned, as far as we could discern, following God's call. Yes, we were having a 2-week holiday, but we were actually going out to find out about Christian mission in the west of China and how we might possibly be involved. Anyway, several months beforehand, we'd made contact with somebody. And they said, yes, come, I'll meet you. I'll be in Xining, the city in question. No problem at all. Come along. We'll see you there. Anyway, about a month before we set out, we were frantically doing emails, trying to work out contact details and telephone numbers for when we got there, how we'd actually make contact. When we got out there, absolute silence. No responses to any of these emails at all. So we were actually heading out going, well, we might end up just having a 2-week fairly exotic holiday. If we don't manage to make contact with anyone, that's just the way it is. The guy's name was Gabzang Dorji. That's a Tibetan name, actually. He was Norwegian, but he was so enculturated that he went around using a Tibetan name. And he had quite enculturated himself with Tibetan nomad culture, so hence the complete lack of responding to any emails when we were sweating and wondering what was going on. Anyway, when we were arriving, travelling through Beijing from the aeroplane to the train to go to where we were supposed to be going, we were sitting there going, this could just be a holiday for 2 weeks. Let's see what happens. We sat there waiting for our train to depart for the 24-hour journey across the country. The platform is absolutely teeming with people. This is, after all, basically the main transport hub for a country of 1.3 billion people. We're sat there. We're looking out the window. And suddenly there he is, Gabzang Dorji. A divine appointment, if ever there was one. He was just casually walking along the platform, about to get on exactly the same train as us. He was following where God had called him to be. He was called to be in this particular part of China, but actually things that he had to do had called him to Beijing that day. And he was there, and he was getting on the train to come back as quickly as he could. A divine appointment, though. Because actually for us, it was the front end of almost a decade working overseas amongst Tibetans in China, actually trying to bring the good news that actually Jesus heals messed up lives to that part of China. Do you ever get that kind of word or picture? Have you ever had a kind of a divine appointment, if you like? And if you've had a word or a picture, have you ever acted on it? Because actually what I want us to do is actually to name this as a kind of a Christian phenomenon. People get given words. People get given pictures. There are divine appointments. There are Bible verses which suddenly reach out from the page and grab a hold of us. It's the work of the Holy Spirit in our lives. But actually, do we act on it? Philip acted on it, and amazing things happened. So I want us to be listening out for that kind of thing. I want us to be listening out, but realizing and being realistic about ourselves. We are sinful people. We don't always get it right. But actually, when we do hear God, and when we do act on it, and when we do see the results that the Holy Spirit brings about, how much better will we be at listening to God next time around? And I really want to encourage you that this is not something that is restricted to the Holy Joes. The Spirit of God is the ultimate leveler of people. People who have never stepped into church in their lives before have spiritual experiences. They just might not have a Philip or somebody equally inspired by the Holy Spirit to come alongside them and explain it to them. You see, every so often we hear about converts from Islam. How did they come to faith? Well, maybe some of them had a dream. And if that's not the work of the Holy Spirit, I don't know what is. Maybe some of them were actually, as all Muslims do, happily getting on and reading the Quran and reading about this character Isa in the Quran, which is the Arabic word for Jesus, as a man who does phenomenal miracles. And actually that reached out and grabbed them. And they realized that there was something divine about the person they were reading about. Sometimes they quite literally see the supernatural joy of the Lord in the Christians that they know. You see, it's not just people in church, it's people everywhere. People even in the circumstances where you might think that the Lord is furthest from them, and it turns out that the Holy Spirit is quietly working in their life, giving them phenomenal spiritual experiences. Something that the Holy Spirit does for us as much as the Holy Spirit does for everyone. Something that, to be faithful, we actually need to name as what it is, an experience of the Holy Spirit, and then to be faithful in following where the Holy Spirit is leading. You see, the trouble is our normal reaction so often is just to dismiss these things. And actually that's what our secular culture trains us to do. There's that voice whispering, oh, it's not God whispering to you. It's just a coincidence. It's not God giving you a chance to respond to him without utterly overwhelming you with his glory. It's just auto-suggestion. Your own thoughts, your own dreams, your own aspirations. It's not the Spirit of God convicting you about something that's not right in your life that you need to change. Our secular culture says, suppress the unease. Have fun, spend money. But the reality is that actually we'd all do a lot better if we became more and more and more, continually more practiced at listening to the Spirit of God. The trouble is, it's not easy. I'm not going to pretend it's easy for a moment. God is speaking to us. But what if the Spirit is asking us to say something to someone? We'll look a fool. We'll get it wrong. It'll be embarrassing. Worse still, what if the Spirit is asking me to pray for somebody? They'll say no. I won't know what to pray. It's all too risky. And maybe even worse still, because it actually, for each of us, what we don't like is different. But what if the Spirit is asking me to give something away, give something up? What? Really? Out of my money, out of my possessions, out of my freedom, out of my time? In the New Testament, where we most often see the Holy Spirit at work, it's for the purposes of telling others the good news about Jesus, demonstrating the message with power, and meeting the needs of society's poorest and most vulnerable. Or it's building up the church. And in the case we read about today with Philip and the Ethiopian, very much about explaining the message to somebody who needed it explaining to them. But actually, what the Spirit is doing is an amazing thing, because it's not just anyone. In a Spirit-inspired way, Philip is telling the message to somebody who would go on to establish a church that would endure for 2,000 years and counting, and today has about 40 million members in it. Not bad, really, for the embarrassment of running alongside somebody's chariot on the Gaza Road and asking whether they understood what they were reading. But only possible because Philip was practiced at listening to the voice of God's Spirit. So the next time you have a strong conviction inside to do something or to say something or to pray for someone or to give them a gift or to show somebody a verse, and I'm not going to now say just dive in there and do it, because the first thing I'm going to say is weigh it up. Does what you are thinking that you are being spoken to about sound like the voice of the God of the Bible? Always looking on us in love, longing to make us whole and perfect people, reaching out to all so that they might hear about what Jesus has done for them. In the case of that Ethiopian, he was reading, Jesus was led like a lamb to the slaughter, choosing to become the sacrifice for us, choosing to pay the ransom to ultimately set us free from evil. This is the kind of God we worship. So if the things that we are thinking the Spirit might be saying to us are not in line with the character of the God that we worship, then yes, maybe you are just thinking things in your own head. But actually, if they are in line with what God might be wanting for all of his people, then the more we act on it, the more we get to know. We were singing about the still small voice of the Spirit. So if, as far as you can tell, your motivations are God's motivations, then you are probably hearing from the Spirit. Please act on it. Please act on it not just for the sake of your own faith and being built up, but for the sake of us as a church, that we might be encouraged and built up, and for the sake of us as a society, that we may get used to hearing God and seeing what God is doing amongst us. But evaluate it. Weigh it up. Act on it. Evaluate it. Was I right? Did I hear God? This is what hearing the Spirit's voice is like. Or no, that was me getting my motivations mixed up. But where it has been the Spirit, get to know that voice, ready for next time. Because I assure you that this kind of with the Spirit life is so much more exciting than the without version. Now, please don't hear me wrong. None of us has some kind of hotline to God. I've already said that God doesn't overwhelm our need for faith. We don't live in some kind of perfect, miracle-a-minute kind of world. In a moment in our prayers, we're going to be praying for Nepal, and if that's not strong enough a reminder that we don't live in a perfect world, then I don't know what is. But God doesn't overwhelm our capacity for faith with his glorious presence, because that would be heaven. And that's not the life we are living yet. But for now, we can, like Philip, get better at hearing his Spirit and following. Just as much as we can get better at hearing him through his word, the Bible, and following. There are very, very few people who get to live a life characterized by unquestionable Holy Spirit miracle after unquestionable Holy Spirit miracle. And we don't often get to hear about miracles as in the Spirit whisking Philip away and having him turn up 20 miles away. But actually, sometimes when we're looking out for it, the right 1 out of 1 billion people walks past your train's carriage window and gets on the same train as you.